Why would someone carry an ID card that looked like it belonged in a museum? The security guard didn't know. He just knew it was funny. The laminated card in his hand was so old, the edges had worn soft from too many years of being handled by too many fingers. The photograph showed a younger woman, stone-cold eyes, regulation short hair, the kind of expression that suggested she'd never smiled for a camera in her life. No visible expiration date. Just a red authorization bar and a QR strip encoded with information that existed somewhere in databases most people didn't know existed. The guard laughed, actually laughed out loud. His partner leaned over for a closer look, grinning like he discovered something genuinely amusing on an otherwise boring Tuesday morning. What they didn't know was that the woman standing in front of them had been waiting for this moment, not hopping for it, not dreading it, just waiting, with the kind of patience you learn in places where impatience can get you killed. Her name was Avery Cross, 54 years old, standing in the reception area of a VA medical campus on a morning that still held that crisp bite of early autumn, though you could already feel the day's heat beginning to coil up from the asphalt like a promise of discomfort to come. She wore civilian clothes, a windbreaker zipped halfway up over a plain white t-shirt, sturdy black boots that had seen better years but still held their polish, faded jeans with wear patterns that spoke of work, not fashion, no makeup, no jewelry except for a thin gold watch that caught the fluorescent light as she moved. Her silver hair was braided tight and low down her back, not out of vanity, but the kind of discipline that becomes second nature after decades of practice. She walked with a subtle limp that didn't slow her down, just gave her stride a measured rhythm, like someone who'd learned to work around old injuries without letting them define her. Her right hand held a worn leather wallet. Her left clutched a canvas folder marked only with faint smudged initials that might have once meant something to someone who knew how to read them. But here's what mattered in that moment. The two young security personnel leaning against the scanner station had been there since before dawn and had several more hours to kill. Private Mendoza, maybe 22, with the soft edges of someone who'd never deployed beyond the wire. His partner, PFC Kinley, had one boot kicked up against the counter while he nursed lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup that had seen better mornings. Neither looked old enough to remember when smartphones weren't standard issue, much less when military IDs looked different than they did today. And that's where the problem started. "Morning, ma'am," Mendoza said without much enthusiasm, giving Avery a glance before his eyes dropped to the ID she slid across the laminated countertop. His expression changed immediately, that slow shift from boredom to amusement. "Whoa, that's vintage." Kinley leaned over, looked, actually laughed out loud. "What is this, like Phase 1 clearance from the Stone Age?" Avery didn't respond, just stood there with that particular kind of stillness that suggested she'd waded through worse conversations than this one. The kind of stillness that felt earned rather than passive. Her eyes weren't on the two soldiers making jokes at her expense. They were fixed on the scanner screen, watching something the guards hadn't noticed yet. "Seriously though," Kinley added, his grin widening, "did you print this off Wikipedia? This thing belongs in the Smithsonian." Mendoza gave his own chuckle, the kind that said he was enjoying himself more than his job usually allowed. "All right, let's see if this bad boy even works anymore." He picked up the card with two fingers like it might be contagious and waved it under the scanner with exaggerated ceremony. A red light flashed once, then again. The screen blinked, unrecognized format, please retry. "Uh-huh," Mendoza said, glancing over his shoulder at his partner with a satisfied smirk. "Called it. System doesn't even know what to do with this thing." He slid the card back toward Avery with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd proven his point. "Ma'am, unless that card's got some kind of magic powers, it's not getting you past this desk. You're gonna need something from this century." Kinley's grin widened as he took another sip of his coffee. "Maybe it's one of those ghost program cards. Operation Classified Grandma or something. And here's where you have to understand something about respect, about assumption, about the dangerous space between what you think you know and what's actually true. Because in that moment, those two young soldiers weren't just mocking an old ID card. They were dismissing a human being standing right in front of them. Someone who had shown up, followed protocol, presented credentials, and was now being treated like a punchline in their morning routine. Avery remained absolutely motionless, the kind of stillness that wasn't passive at all but deliberate, controlled, like someone who'd learned the value of patience in environments where your survival depended on staying calm when others were panicking. Her eyes weren't on the guards anymore. They were on the scanner screen, on a small amber light above the terminal that had started blinking, something the guards hadn't noticed yet. Mendoza tried again, this time swiping the card slower, amused by his own persistence. Maybe if I wave it around 3 times and chant "please work," it'll click. The scanner made a different sound. Not the electronic beep they were used to, but a hard mechanical snap followed by a soft digital hum that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the system. The screen went black for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then something new appeared. A gold circle materialized in the center of the dark screen, containing a downward-pointing black triangle that began to rotate. Slowly, hypnotically. Around its edge, encrypted symbols pulsed in a pattern that neither guard recognized. The triangle spun once, twice, picking up speed until it became a blur of motion that somehow remained perfectly clear. Then a line of red text appeared beneath the emblem, bold capital letters that seemed to burn themselves into the screen. Flag Protocol Alpha, Red Zone, Authorized Identity DETCTED. The scanner beeped twice, sharp and urgent. Then the entire terminal locked with a finality that sounded like a vault door closing. Kinley stopped mid-sip, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Mendoza's fingers went rigid an inch from the keyboard, like he'd suddenly realized he might be touching something that could bite back. Avery looked up slowly, meeting their eyes with the same calm expression she'd worn since walking through the door. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly through the sudden silence. "Looks like the card worked." For several heartbeats, nobody moved. The only sound was the low mechanical hum coming from the scanner and the distant whisper of air conditioning through overhead vents. The emblem on the screen continued its steady rotation, not animated like a computer graphic, but alive in a way that made both soldiers instinctively step back from the terminal. What happens when you realize you've made a mistake that can't be undone? When the joke stops being funny and starts being evidence? When the person you dismissed as irrelevant turns out to be someone you should have treated with the respect they never demanded but absolutely deserved? Those two guards were about to find out. The triangle spun clockwise once more. Then the screen flashed red with new text. Security lock engaged. Restricted authorization DETCTED. Notify command authority. Protocol Alpha. Behind the desk, the terminal made a low, warbling tone that neither Mendoza nor Kinley had ever heard before. Down the hallway, a small amber light began blinking beside what looked like a fire suppression panel. Then another light joined it. Then another. Mendoza's hand hovered over the keyboard like he was afraid to touch it. That's not supposed to happen." "What did you do?" Kinley's voice had lost all its earlier amusement. "I didn't do anything. I just scanned her card." "Then why is the whole building lighting up?" Avery didn't answer. She just stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, watching the cascade of responses her ID had triggered. Not surprised, not satisfied, just watching, like someone who'd seen this play out before and knew exactly how it ended. The main reception area felt different now. Larger, colder, All those polished floors and beige walls designed to move people efficiently through government processes suddenly felt like a trap closing around two soldiers who just realized they might have stepped on something bigger than themselves. A tiny radio near the check-in desk still played classic country that nobody was listening to anymore. The background noise that had made silence feel less institutional now just made the growing tension more acute. Mendoza fumbled for his radio. This is checkpoint 1. We've got a situation here, some kind of system alert." Static crackled back at him, then a voice crisp and professional. "Checkpoint 1, specify nature of alert." "I don't know. The scanner just activated some kind of protocol. Gold emblem, alpha something." The radio went silent for 3 full seconds. Then the voice came back, different now, sharper. "Did you say alpha protocol?" "Yes, sir, it's showing." "Do not touch that terminal. Do not move the card. Do not let anyone leave that area. Command authority is responding immediately." The connection cut off. Kinley set his coffee cup down very carefully, like he was suddenly aware that any sudden movement might make things worse. "What the hell is Alpha Protocol?" "How should I know?" Mendoza's voice had gone up half an octave. "They don't teach us about ghost programs in basic security training." Avery still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken. But if you were paying attention, if you knew what to look for, you might have noticed the slight shift in her posture. The way her weight settled more evenly on both feet. The way her breathing stayed perfectly level while everyone else's was getting shallow and quick. The way her eyes tracked movements in her peripheral vision without appearing to look anywhere but straight ahead. These weren't the movements of someone caught off guard. These were the movements of someone who'd spent years training for environments where situational awareness was the difference between making it home and not making it home at all. Down the hallway, footsteps approached, multiple sets, moving with purpose, not running but not strolling either, the kind of pace that suggested urgency wrapped in discipline. 3 people entered the reception area. 2 military police in full gear, hands resting on their sidearms in that casual way that wasn't casual at all. Behind them, a facilities administrator clutching a tablet like it was the only solid thing in an increasingly unstable reality. The administrator's eyes went to the screen, to the still rotating emblem, to Avery standing motionless in front of the terminal. Is that what I think it is?" One of the MPs stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step to the side while we verify." "She's not going anywhere." The voice came from the entrance. Everyone turned. A woman in her late 40s stood in the doorway, colonel's eagles on her uniform, hair pulled back in a regulation bun, eyes that had seen too many briefings and not enough sleep. She walked into the room like she owned it, which in a very real sense she did. Colonel Patricia McBride, facility commander, the kind of officer who'd earned her rank through competence rather than connections, and who'd learned long ago that leadership meant showing up when things got complicated. She looked at the emblem on the screen, then at Avery, then back at the screen. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Recognition, not of a face but of a situation. "Clear the room," she said quietly. "Everyone except the individual who presented the ID." The administrator opened his mouth like he wanted to object, then thought better of it. The MPs exchanged glances, then moved toward the exit. Mendoza and Kinley both started to follow. "Not you two," McBride said without looking at them. "You stay exactly where you are." The room emptied. The door closed. The only sounds now were the mechanical hum of the scanner and the subtle whisper of the building's ventilation system. McBride walked over to the terminal, studied the screen for a long moment, then looked at Avery with an expression that was hard to read. "How long has it been?" she asked. "Since I needed to use it," Avery's voice was calm. "First time." "But you knew it would work." "I knew someone would be watching the system. I knew if I ever used it, It would get attention from the right people. McBride nodded slowly. You know what this is going to require. Full verification, command authority, probably a closed-door briefing that nobody admits happened. You've done this before. I've done a lot of things before, Colonel. Most of them I'd prefer stayed before. There was a weight to that statement, a history that existed in the space between what was said and what was understood. McBride seemed to recognize it. She turned to face Mendoza and Kinley, both of whom were standing very still, faces pale, realizing they were witnessing something far outside their clearance level. Do you two understand what you just did? McBride asked quietly. Mendoza swallowed hard. No, ma'am. You mock someone carrying alpha-level clearance. Do you know what that means? No, ma'am. It means that card you were laughing at has authorization that exists above levels you'll never even hear about. It means the person carrying it has done things, seen things, been places that don't appear in any official record. It means you just treated someone with more operational experience than everyone in this building combined like she was a joke. Kinley's voice came out barely above a whisper. We didn't know. No, McBride agreed. You didn't, but here's what you should have known. Respect isn't something you withhold until someone proves they deserve it. Respect is something you give freely until someone proves they don't deserve it. And nothing about this woman walking through that door suggested she deserved to be mocked. Silence settled over the room like snow, heavy, absolute. McBride looked back at Avery. I'm going to need you to come with me. There are protocols for this, verifications, people who need to be notified. I understand. And I'm going to need that card secured properly. It shouldn't have worked at a standard checkpoint. But it did. Yes, it did, which means someone made sure it would, someone who knew you might need it someday. Avery picked up her ID from the terminal, slid it back into her wallet with the same careful precision she'd used when presenting it. I appreciate discretion, Colonel. You'll have it, but first, we need to deal with this properly. Chain of command, documentation, all the things that make the military run smoothly even when nothing about a situation is smooth. She gestured toward the door. Avery followed. As they passed Mendoza and Kinley, both guards stood at attention, eyes forward, faces carefully neutral. But you could see it in the tension around their eyes, in the set of their jaws. The understanding that they'd crossed a line they hadn't known existed, and that there would be consequences they hadn't anticipated. The hallway outside felt different now, quieter, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. Other personnel had gathered at a discreet distance, drawn by rumors spreading faster than official communication, all of them trying to look busy while watching the woman in civilian clothes walk past with the facility commander like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because here's the truth about dignity. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need validation from people who wouldn't recognize it anyway. Dignity is what you carry with you when everyone else has decided you're not worth their respect. It's what sustains you when the world treats you like you're invisible or irrelevant or past your expiration date. Avery Cross had walked into that building knowing exactly what would happen. She'd known those guards would see an old ID card and make assumptions. She'd known they would laugh, would mock, would treat her like a punchline in their boring morning. She'd known all of it, and she'd presented that card anyway. Not to prove a point, not to teach a lesson, but because sometimes the only way to remind people that respect matters is to show them what happens when they forget. Have you ever watched someone's confidence evaporate in real time? That slow, creeping realization that they've made a mistake they can't take back, that the joke they thought was harmless was actually the beginning of something they couldn't control. It's like watching ice crack under someone's feet. You can see the exact moment they understand they're standing on something that won't hold their weight. Mendoza and Kinley were experiencing that right now, standing in the reception area, alone. the scanner terminal still displaying that gold emblem with its rotating triangle and encrypted symbols that neither of them understood. The building around them had gone quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes before official consequences, before paperwork gets filed, before careers get adjusted in ways that don't show up on performance reviews but change everything anyway. What do we do? Kinley's voice had lost all its earlier cockiness. Mendoza stared at the terminal like it might suddenly offer answers. I don't know, she said, stay here, so we stay here. But what if? There is no what if. We stay. We wait. We do exactly what the colonel told us to do, and we hope that whatever comes next isn't as bad as it could be. But they both knew it would be bad. You didn't mock someone with alpha-level clearance and walk away without consequences. The question wasn't whether there would be punishment. The question was how severe it would be and whether their careers could survive it. Down the corridor, Colonel McBride led Avery through a series of turns that took them away from the main administrative areas and toward a section of the building most visitors never saw. Secure conference rooms, classified briefing spaces, the kind of rooms where conversations happen that never officially occurred. They passed other personnel along the way, junior officers who snapped to attention, civilian contractors who moved aside without being asked. Everyone they encountered seemed to understand instinctively that whatever was happening, it existed at a level above their pay grade and their need to know. You didn't have to come here, McBride said as they walked. Could have handled this through official channels, made a phone call, filed a complaint. Could have, Avery agreed, but that's not what this was about. Then what was it about? Avery considered the question for several steps before answering. Reminding myself that some things still matter, that the work we did, the places we went, the things we saw, they weren't erased just because time passed and paperwork got sealed and the world moved on without us. You could have just looked at your DD-214, confirmed your service record, reminded yourself that way. Paper doesn't prove anything, Colonel. Paper just documents what already happened. This, she gestured vaguely back toward the reception area. This proved that someone remembered, that the systems we built still work, that clearances we earned still mean something even when nobody's supposed to know they exist. They reached a conference room door marked only with a number, no name, no indication of what happened inside. McBride used a key card to unlock it, held the door open. Wait here, I need to make some calls, notify the right people, get the authorization chain moving. How long? However long it takes to wake up people who thought they'd never have to think about alpha protocols again. The door closed. Avery stood in a room that looked like every secure briefing space she'd ever been in. Plain table, uncomfortable chairs, walls designed to absorb sound and block signals, a screen mounted at one end for classified presentations. The smell of old coffee and air conditioning and the accumulated tension of 1,000 conversations about things people couldn't talk about afterward. She sat down, not because she was tired, though she was, not because she was nervous, though there was a tight knot of anxiety in her chest that she'd learned to breathe around rather than through. She sat because that's what you did in spaces like this. You sat. You waited. You let the process unfold according to protocols that existed for good reasons, even when those reasons had been classified so long ago that most people had forgotten they ever existed. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Avery didn't fidget, didn't check her watch, didn't pull out her phone to scroll through news she didn't care about. She just sat there with her hands folded on the table, eyes on the wall opposite her, mind somewhere between present awareness and distant memory. The door opened. McBride returned, followed by two other officers. One was a Major Avery didn't recognize. The other was a civilian in a suit that looked expensive enough to suggest someone who worked in places where military ranks didn't apply. Ms. Cross, the civilian said, taking a seat across from her. Or should I say Sergeant Cross, Captain Cross? I'm afraid your file has so many redactions I'm not entirely sure what rank you retired under. Avery is fine. I'm Henderson, Duty Liaison for Clearance Verification. This is Major Williams from Facility Security. We're here to confirm the validity of the credentials you presented and to understand why you chose to activate a protocol that hasn't been used in almost 15 years. Avery met his eyes steadily. The card is valid. You already know that, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. The card exists in a database that's not supposed to be accessed by standard security systems. It triggered protocols that required authorization from 3 separate command levels just to acknowledge they'd been triggered. So yes, the card is valid. But that doesn't explain why you chose to use it at a routine checkpoint instead of going through proper channels. Because proper channels assume I want to make noise. I don't want to make noise. I just wanted to confirm that after all these years, after all the paperwork and the classifications and the official forgetting, someone still remembered that some service doesn't have an expiration date. Henderson leaned back in his chair. You could have gotten those 2 guards court-martialed. You understand that. Alpha protocol violations aren't just disciplinary issues. They're security breaches, career-ending events. Could have, Avery agreed. But I didn't ask for that. I just presented credentials I earned and expected to be treated with basic professional courtesy. What happened after that was their choice, not mine. Major Williams, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. Do you have any idea how much disruption your little test caused? We had to lock down 3 separate secure communication channels, pull personnel from active duties, notify command structures that haven't been activated for operations since before some of these soldiers were born. I'm aware. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like someone trying to prove a point rather than someone with legitimate business at a VA facility. Avery's expression didn't change, but her voice got quieter, harder. Major, I've been to places you can't imagine doing work you'll never be cleared to know about. I've earned clearances that exist above levels you'll never reach in your entire career. I've lost friends whose names can't be spoken aloud and carried secrets that will die with me because that's what the mission required. So when I tell you this wasn't about proving a point, you can choose to believe me or not. But either way, I don't owe you an explanation for using credentials I earned through service you can't comprehend. Silence filled the room. The kind of silence that follows when someone speaks a truth so fundamental that arguing against it would only diminish everyone involved. Henderson cleared his throat. The card will be flagged in the system. If you use it again, it won't trigger the same level of response. The surprise factor is gone. I don't plan on using it again. Then why use it now? Because I needed to know if it would still work. If the promises made to me decades ago were still being kept. If the people who told me I'd earned something that wouldn't expire actually meant it. And now you know. Now I know. McBride, who'd been standing near the door, spoke up. What about Mendoza and Kinley? They're still waiting in the reception area. Protocol says they need to be debriefed and reassigned. Henderson looked at Avery. Your call. You want them court-martialed, we can make that happen. You want them reassigned to a different facility, we can do that too. Or we can handle this as an internal discipline issue and let their chain of command decide appropriate consequences. Avery thought about it. About 2 young soldiers who'd made the mistake of treating someone with disrespect because they'd made assumptions based on appearances. About how easy it is to forget that every person you encounter has a history you don't know and has earned things you can't see. Internal discipline, she said finally. They're young. They made a mistake. Let them learn from it without it destroying their careers. You're being generous. I'm being practical. They didn't know what they were doing. Punishing ignorance with career destruction doesn't make them better soldiers. It just makes them bitter. Let their commanders handle it. Let them understand what they did wrong. but don't break them for not knowing something they'd never been taught. Henderson nodded. Fair enough. I'll note your recommendation in the official record, which, for clarity, will be heavily classified and accessible only to people who already know it exists. Understood. Do you need anything else from us? Medical services, counseling, administrative support? No, I came here for one thing, I got it. Now I'd like to go home. McBride opened the door. I'll walk you out. They left the conference room, leaving Henderson and Williams to their paperwork and their classified notations in files that would never be declassified. The hallway felt different now, less tense, like whatever had needed to happen had happened, and the building could return to its normal rhythm. But not quite yet. They passed other personnel who studiously avoided eye contact, all of them aware that something significant had occurred, but none of them cleared to ask about it. They passed administrative offices where phones were ringing and keyboards were clicking, and the normal business of government was resuming after a brief but memorable interruption. They passed the memorial case filled with photographs and names and dates, the quiet accounting of service that most visitors never stopped to read. You carrying much weight these days? McBride asked quietly. Avery took a moment to consider the question. Weight doesn't go anywhere, you just get stronger at carrying it. That's what I figured you'd say. They reached a window that looked out over the parking lot where the morning sun was now high enough to make the asphalt shimmer with heat. The kind of heat that makes you squint even through glass, that promises an afternoon of seeking shade and wishing for air conditioning. Those boys back there, McBride said, they're not bad soldiers, just young. Haven't learned yet that respect isn't something you withhold until someone proves they deserve it. They'll learn, Avery said, or they won't last. You ever think about teaching? We could use instructors who understand that leadership isn't about rank. It's about how you treat people when nobody's watching. I think about a lot of things. Most of them I decide against. McBride smiled slightly. Fair enough. But if you ever change your mind about staying quiet, there are people who could benefit from hearing your voice. Avery looked out the window at her truck, sitting alone in the visitor parking area. I've said what needed saying. Today was just a reminder that some conversations aren't finished. No, McBride agreed, they're not. They walked the remaining distance to the side exit in comfortable silence. No ceremony, no formal farewell, just two professionals who understood that some things didn't require words. McBride held the door open. Take care of yourself, Avery. Always do. And if you ever need anything, I know where to find you. Avery stepped out into the bright morning air. The heat was building now, promising another scorching afternoon, but the early clarity was still there. That particular quality of light that made everything seem sharper, more defined, more real. Her truck started on the first turn of the key, engine settling into its familiar rumble. She adjusted the rearview mirror out of habit and caught a glimpse of the building behind her. Somewhere inside, people were probably still trying to understand what had just happened, trying to reconcile the woman in civilian clothes with the clearance levels that shouldn't exist. She didn't need to understand it, she'd lived it. What do you do when you're 22 years old, standing at a security checkpoint, and you've just realized that the person you mocked has more authority than everyone in the building combined? When the joke you thought was harmless has turned into an official incident that required notification from command levels you didn't know existed. You stand there, very still, hopping that maybe if you don't move, don't speak, don't even breathe too loud, the situation will somehow resolve itself in a way that doesn't end your career before it's really started. Mendoza and Kinley stood at attention beside the scanner terminal. Neither had spoken in 20 minutes. Neither knew what to say. The emblem had finally stopped rotating on the screen, replaced by a simple message. System locked, awaiting command authorization. Footsteps approached from down the hall. Both guards straightened even more, if that was possible. Colonel McBride appeared first, followed by Major Williams and a civilian in an expensive suit. All three looked like they'd just come from a meeting that nobody would ever officially acknowledge had happened. McBride stopped in front of the two guards, looked at them both with an expression that managed to be disappointed without being cruel. "Do you two understand what happened here this morning?" "Yes, ma'am," Mendoza said, though his voice suggested he only understood parts of it. "Explain it to me." We failed to show proper respect to someone with classified clearance. We made assumptions based on appearances instead of following proper protocol. That's part of it, but the larger failure was simpler than that. You treated someone as less than they were because they didn't match your expectations of what they should be. And that's a problem that goes beyond security protocols. Kinley swallowed hard. "Ma'am, we didn't know." "That's exactly the point. You didn't know. But instead of treating her with basic professional courtesy while you figured it out, you chose mockery. You chose disrespect. You chose to make someone's legitimate business at this facility into entertainment for your own boredom." Both guards stood silent. What could they say? She was right, completely, undeniably right. Major Williams stepped forward. "You're both being reassigned effective immediately. Not as punishment exactly, but as an educational opportunity. You're going to spend the next 30 days working facilities maintenance under the direct supervision of the custodial staff. You'll learn what it's like to be the people everyone else walks past without noticing. The people who do essential work that nobody acknowledges. And maybe, if you pay attention, you'll learn something about humility." 30 days. Kinley's voice came out higher than he probably intended. "Consider it generous," Williams said flatly. "The woman you mocked recommended internal discipline rather than formal charges. She could have ended both your careers with a single statement. Instead, she chose to give you a chance to learn from this. I suggest you don't waste it." McBride pulled a document from her jacket pocket. "This is your official reassignment paperwork. Report to the custodial supervisor at 600 tomorrow. Bring work clothes. Leave your attitudes somewhere you won't need them anymore." She handed the papers to Mendoza, who took them like they might burn him. "And understand something else. What happened here this morning is classified at levels you'll never be cleared for. You don't talk about it. You don't ask questions about it. You especially don't share it on social media or with your friends. As far as you're concerned, you had a routine morning that got disrupted by a system malfunction that was quickly resolved. Nothing more." "Yes, ma'am," both guards said in unison. "Dismissed. Get your belongings and clear out. Your replacements are already being briefed." Mendoza and Kinley moved toward the back room where they'd stashed their personal items, both walking like they'd aged several years in the past hour. You could see it in their posture, in the set of their shoulders, in the way they avoided looking at anyone they passed in the hallway. Humiliation is a powerful teacher, but only if you're willing to learn from it. The custodial supervisor turned out to be a woman named Martinez who'd been working at the facility for 12 years and had seen every kind of person the military could produce. She looked at Mendoza and Kinley when they reported the next morning like she'd already heard the story and had zero sympathy for their situation. "You're here to learn," she said without preamble. "Not to serve time, not to count down days, to actually learn something about how this facility functions and about the people who make it function. You treat my staff with respect, you work hard, you keep your mouths shut, and maybe you'll come out of this better than you went in. Clear?" "Yes, ma'am," they both said. "Good. Grab mops. First lesson is that every floor in this building gets cleaned the same way, regardless of who walks on it. Doesn't matter if it's the main conference room or the custodial closet. Clean is clean." They spent that first day learning the physical reality of work they'd never paid attention to before. Mopping floors, emptying trash, cleaning bathrooms that served hundreds of people every day, replacing light fixtures, restocking supplies. The kind of work that's absolutely essential but completely invisible until it stops getting done. By the end of the first week, both guards had developed a new appreciation for the people who kept the facility running. The custodial staff who showed up before dawn to make sure everything was ready. The maintenance workers who fixed things before they broke completely. The logistics personnel who ensured supplies were available before they ran out. All the invisible work that made the visible work possible. Martinez watched them carefully during those first days. Not hovering, not micromanaging, but observing, seeing how they responded to instructions, how they treated her staff, whether they brought the same dismissive attitude to this work that they'd brought to their security duties. What she saw encouraged her, slowly, grudgingly. "They're learning," she told McBride during one of their regular briefings. "Doesn't mean they like it, but they're learning." "Good enough," McBride said. "Sometimes that's all we can ask for." Meanwhile, Avery Cross drove away from the VA facility and didn't look back. The drive through the facility grounds was quiet. She passed the loading dock where maintenance crews were beginning their daily routines, past administrative buildings where the normal business of government was resuming after what would officially be classified as a brief system interruption requiring command-level verification. Near the main entrance, she spotted two familiar figures in maintenance coveralls, each carrying cleaning equipment like they were getting acquainted with tools they'd never expected to use. Mendoza and Kinley, beginning their education in consequences. Kinley looked up as her truck approached. For a moment, their eyes met through the windshield. His expression was sheepish, almost apologetic. He raised his hand in a small wave that seemed more like an acknowledgement than a greeting. Avery didn't slow down, but she nodded once, just slightly. "Enough." Then she was past the gate and onto the access road that led back to the highway. Back to whatever life looked like when you weren't reminding people that respect is something you give until someone proves they don't deserve it. Behind her, the VA facility settled back into its routine, but something had shifted there, something that would ripple outward in small ways, in how people looked at identification they didn't recognize, in how they spoke to visitors who didn't fit their expectations, in the understanding that assumptions could be dangerous when you didn't know who you were talking to. From a third-floor window, Colonel McBride watched the truck disappear into traffic. A young staffer approached with a tablet full of incident reports and requests for clarification. "Colonel, what should I put in the official record about this morning's events?" McBride continued watching the road for a moment before answering. "Put down that we had a security system verification that resolved without incident. All relevant personnel have been appropriately briefed." And the individual who triggered the alert, the woman with the Alpha clearance. "What individual?" The staffer looked confused. "The woman with the classified ID, what about her?" McBride turned away from the window. "I don't know what you're talking about. Alpha clearances don't exist." She walked away, leaving the staffer with a tablet full of reports about something that officially never happened. And somewhere on the highway heading home, Avery Cross drove with the windows down and the radio playing softly. The morning had turned into afternoon, the heat building toward that scorching peak that made you grateful for air conditioning and shade. But for now, the wind through the open windows was enough. She thought about those two young guards, about the mistake they'd made and the lesson they were learning, about whether they'd carry that lesson forward into the rest of their careers or whether they'd forget it as soon as their 30-day reassignment ended. She hoped they'd remember, not because she needed their acknowledgement or their apology, but because the military worked better when people understood that rank and clearance and authority were less important than how you treated the person standing in front of you. The highway stretched ahead, familiar and unremarkable, traffic moving at its usual pace. Other drivers focused on their own destinations, their own concerns, their own lives. none of them knowing that the woman in the old truck had just reminded an entire facility that dignity doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to exist. She passed a rest stop, considered pulling over for coffee, decided against it. She was 40 minutes from home. She could wait. Besides, the coffee at those places was never as good as what she could make herself. The radio shifted from one song to another. Something about lost love and found highways and the price of freedom. She didn't change the station. Just let the music fill the cab while her mind wandered through thoughts that had nothing to do with security protocols or classified clearances or lessons learned. She thought about dinner, about whether she had enough ingredients for the soup she'd been planning or whether she'd need to stop at the store, about the book sitting on her nightstand that she'd been meaning to finish for 3 weeks, about the quiet evening ahead with no expectations, no protocols, no need to be anyone other than exactly who she was. Sometimes that was enough, more than enough actually. The truck's engine hummed steadily, that familiar sound that meant everything was working the way it should. The kind of mechanical reliability that came from regular maintenance and treating machines like they deserved respect for the work they did. Not so different from how you should treat people, really. She took the exit toward home. Local roads now, familiar landmarks passing by. The gas station where she always filled up on Sundays. The small grocery store that had better produce than the big chains. The library where she sometimes spent afternoons when the weather was too hot for outdoor work. Her neighborhood appeared gradually. Modest houses on tree-lined streets, mailboxes with hand-painted numbers, lawns in various states of maintenance depending on who lived there and what they valued. The kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names but respected each other's privacy. She pulled into her driveway, turned off the engine, sat there for a moment in the sudden silence, feeling the heat of the day pressing in through the windshield now that the breeze from driving had stopped. Then she grabbed her wallet and her canvas folder and stepped out into the afternoon sun. Her house looked the same as it had when she'd left that morning. Small, well-maintained, nothing special to anyone who didn't live there, but to her, it meant something more than just shelter. It meant the life she'd built after the life she wasn't allowed to talk about. The quiet existence she'd earned through years of not being quiet at all. She unlocked the front door, stepped inside, let the air conditioning wash over her like a blessing. And somewhere back at the VA facility, 2 young soldiers were learning to mop floors with the same attention to detail they should have brought to checking identification cards. Learning that every task deserved respect, every person deserved courtesy, and that the most important lessons often came from the mistakes that hurt the most to acknowledge. Does time heal all wounds, or does it just teach you to carry them differently? Avery Cross had spent years thinking about that question. Years of carrying weight that never got lighter, just more familiar, more manageable. Like an old injury that you learned to work around until you almost forgot it was there. Almost. The afternoon stretched into evening. She made her soup. Simple vegetables and broth and herbs from her own garden. Nothing fancy. Nothing that required following a recipe or measuring precisely. Just the kind of cooking you do when you've made the same thing 100 times and your hands know what to do without your brain having to supervise. While the soup simmered, she sat on her back porch with a glass of water and watched the sun angle lower toward the horizon. The heat had peaked hours ago and was finally starting to ease. Not much, but enough that being outside didn't feel like punishment. Her phone rang once. She looked at the number, didn't recognize it, let it go to voicemail. If it was important, they'd leave a message. If it wasn't, she'd saved herself a conversation she didn't need. The evening birds started their chorus. That particular sound that marked the transition from day to night, from heat to slightly less heat, from the demands of the active world to the quieter expectations of rest. She thought about the morning, about that moment when the scanner had activated and those 2 young guards had realized their joke had become something else entirely. about Colonel McBride and her quiet competence, about the choice she'd made to recommend internal discipline rather than formal charges. Some people might have pushed for harsher punishment, might have seen it as an opportunity to make an example, to show that disrespect carried serious consequences. And maybe they would have been right. Maybe Mendoza and Kinley needed that level of correction. But Avery had seen what happened when you broke people instead of teaching them, had watched careers destroyed and lives derailed over mistakes that could have been learning opportunities if handled differently, had carried her own regrets about times when she'd been too harsh, too quick to judge, too willing to let someone fall instead of helping them find their footing. The military needed good soldiers, not perfect ones, good ones who learned from their mistakes and carried those lessons forward into the rest of their service. And sometimes the best way to create good soldiers was to let them fail in ways that hurt their pride more than their careers. Her phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. She listened to it. "Ms. Cross, this is Henderson from this morning. Just wanted to let you know that your clearance has been noted in the appropriate systems and flagged for special handling. If you ever need to use it again, the response will be more discreet. Also wanted to say that what you did today, choosing education over punishment for those guards, that showed more leadership than most people in uniform demonstrate their entire careers. Take care." She deleted the message, not because she didn't appreciate it, but because some things didn't need to be saved. Some acknowledgments were meant to exist in the moment, and then fade away like conversations that mattered at the time but didn't need to be preserved. The soup was ready. She ate on the porch, watching the light change as evening deepened toward night, tasting the familiar flavors and finding comfort in the simplicity of a meal made with her own hands from ingredients she'd chosen herself. Independence came in small forms sometimes. The freedom to eat what you wanted when you wanted, to sit in silence without anyone asking what you were thinking, to exist without having to explain yourself or justify your presence or prove that you deserved to take up space in the world. These were luxuries she'd earned through service most people would never understand, through sacrifices that couldn't be spoken about, through choices that had cost more than anyone should have to pay, but that she'd made anyway because that's what the mission required. And here's the thing about that kind of service. Nobody thanks you for it. Not really. Oh, they might say thank you for your service in passing the way people say bless you when someone sneezes. Automatic, expected, meaningless in its repetition. But the real thanks, if it came at all, came in moments like this. In the quiet evening, in the soup made from her own recipe, in the knowledge that she'd done something that mattered, even if nobody could acknowledge what that something was. She finished eating, washed her bowl and put it in the drainer, made a cup of tea and took it back to the porch because the evening was too pleasant to waste inside even with air conditioning. The stars were starting to appear, that slow revelation of light that happened every night but that people rarely stopped to watch. Too busy, too distracted, too focused on screens and notifications and the endless stream of information that demanded attention without deserving it. Avery just sat there, watching the stars emerge, letting her mind wander through memories that had no particular order or significance, random moments from a life lived in fragments, some classified, some mundane, all of them hers in ways that nobody could take away. She thought about the people she'd served with, the ones who'd made it home and the ones who hadn't, the ones whose names she could speak, and the ones whose names were classified along with everything else about operations that officially never happened. She thought about the promises that had been made to her, the assurances that her service mattered, that the clearances she'd earned would be honored, that even when the operations ended and the teams disbanded and the missions were sealed away in vaults that most people didn't know existed, someone would remember. And today she'd proven that those promises had been kept, not perfectly, not without complications, but kept nonetheless. That mattered more than she'd expected it to. The tea grew cold in her hands. She didn't mind, just held the cup and felt its temperature drop as the evening air cooled further. Small sensations that grounded her in the present moment instead of letting her drift too far into memories that could pull you under if you weren't careful. Her neighbor's porch light came on. Motion activated. Someone letting their dog out for the evening walk. The small rhythms of suburban life that continued regardless of what happened in classified facilities or closed-door briefings or conversations that never officially occurred. She was part of that life now, the quiet civilian existence that followed years of being anything but quiet, and she'd made her peace with it mostly, with the trade-off of intensity for stability, of mission focus for personal freedom, of being part of something larger than yourself for the simple privilege of being exactly yourself without apology. The dog barked once, a happy sound, not aggressive, just announcing its presence to the evening. Avery smiled slightly. Small joys, simple pleasures, the things that made ordinary life worth living when extraordinary life had demanded too much for too long. She finished her tea, stood up, stretched muscles that protested the long day even though the day hadn't really been that long by the standards of her previous life. But that was the thing about getting older. Your body remembered every hard thing you'd ever done to it and reminded you periodically that it hadn't forgotten. Fair enough, she hadn't forgotten either. Inside, she washed her teacup and set it beside the soup bowl in the drainer. Turned off the lights except for the small one over the stove that stayed on all night because old habits die hard, and having a navigation light when you wake up at 3 a.m. was just practical. She stood in her darkened living room for a moment, looking at the familiar shapes of furniture and framed photographs, and the accumulated evidence of a life lived mostly in the present tense now instead of the classified past. Good enough, she thought, more than good enough actually. She went to bed feeling something she couldn't quite name, but that felt like satisfaction mixed with vindication, mixed with the simple contentment of having done what needed doing without making it bigger than it had to be. And at the VA facility, the night shift took over from the day shift. New guards at the security checkpoint who'd been briefed about system protocols, but not about why those protocols mattered. Who would check IDs and scan cards and wave people through or turn them away based on what the computer told them without understanding that sometimes the computer was connected to systems that existed for reasons nobody would ever explain to them. Mendoza and Kinley weren't there. They were home, probably, thinking about the mops they'd be wielding tomorrow, about the floors they'd be cleaning, about the lesson they were learning whether they wanted to learn it or not. Time would tell if they understood what had really happened to them, if they grasped that the woman they'd mocked had given them a gift by choosing education over destruction, if they carried that understanding forward into the rest of their careers and treated every person they encountered with the respect that should be automatic rather than earned. Time would tell. But for now, in her small house on a quiet street in a neighborhood that didn't know her history and didn't need to know it, Avery Cross slept the sleep of someone who'd reminded herself, and others, that dignity was something you possessed, not something you proved. And sometimes, that was all the victory anyone needed. Morning came the way it always did, light creeping across the ceiling, birds announcing the day, the automatic coffee maker clicking on at the time she'd programmed it to, filling the house with the smell of something familiar and necessary. Avery woke up the way she always did, gradually, without alarm, just the slow transition from sleep to awareness that came naturally when you'd spent years training yourself to wake up ready for whatever came next. She lay there for a moment, taking inventory, knees stiff but functional, back tight but manageable, mind clear enough for someone who'd slept well and didn't have nightmares anymore, or at least didn't have them every night. Good enough. She got up, made her bed with the same precision she'd learned decades ago and never unlearned because some habits weren't worth breaking. Hospital corners, smooth surface, everything squared away before you moved on to the next task. The coffee was ready. She poured a cup and took it to the kitchen table, where she sat in the same chair she always sat in, looking out the same window she always looked out, watching the same birds do the same things they did every morning. Routine was underrated. People talked about excitement and adventure like they were the only things worth having. But routine meant stability, predictability, the luxury of knowing what came next instead of constantly being on alert for threats that might appear from anywhere. She sipped her coffee and thought about nothing in particular. Let her mind wander without purpose or destination. The kind of mental drift that was only possible when you weren't planning missions or analyzing threats or calculating tactical responses to situations that might develop. Her phone buzzed, text message. She glanced at it. Colonel McBride, guards completed first week. Martinez says they're learning, thought you'd want to know. Avery typed back, good. Nothing else needed saying. The message was just courtesy. An acknowledgement that McBride understood why Avery had chosen the path she'd chosen and was making sure it worked out the way it was supposed to. Professional courtesy between professionals. Respect given freely because both parties had earned it through years of service that had shaped them into who they were. Avery finished her coffee, washed the cup, put it in the drainer with the other dishes from last night, looked at the day ahead with no particular plans beyond the usual tasks of living. Grocery shopping, maybe, reading, walking, the ordinary activities that filled ordinary days. Except she'd never be entirely ordinary, would she? The clearances she carried, the knowledge she possessed, the things she'd done and seen and been part of, they didn't just disappear because she wore civilian clothes and lived in a quiet neighborhood and drove a truck that looked like 100 other trucks on the highway. They were part of her, woven into who she was in ways that couldn't be separated or explained or set aside. But they didn't define her either. She was more than her service, more than her clearances, more than the sum of missions she'd completed and losses she'd absorbed and choices she'd made when there were no good options, only less bad ones. She was also someone who made good soup, who kept her house clean, who treated her neighbors with courtesy even though they didn't know anything about her beyond what they could observe, who lived a quiet life not because she had to, but because she'd chosen to after years of living any way but quietly. That choice mattered, maybe more than anything else she'd ever done, that choice to step away from the intensity and build something different, something smaller, something that belonged only to her and answered to nobody's expectations but her own. She looked out the window at her street, at the houses where people were beginning their days, backing cars out of driveways, walking dogs, heading off to jobs that had normal schedules and normal expectations and normal levels of stress that didn't involve classified operations or alpha-level clearances. She didn't envy them, didn't pity them, didn't judge them for having lives that were so different from what hers had been. She just existed alongside them, part of the same community, part of the same world, connected by the ordinary things that connected people everywhere, regardless of what they'd done before or what secrets they carried or what they knew that others didn't. And maybe that was its own kind of service, living among people who didn't know what you'd sacrificed for their safety, maintaining normalcy when you understood exactly how fragile normal could be, choosing gentleness when you'd been trained for the opposite. Maybe that took more strength than the missions ever had. She went about her day, shopping, reading, sitting on her porch when the heat peaked, drinking ice water and watching the world continue its usual patterns. Nothing remarkable happened. Nothing that would make a good story or teach a dramatic lesson or reveal some profound truth. Just life, simple, ordinary, valuable precisely because it was hers to live however she chose. Evening came again, the same routine as the night before. Soup, tea, porch, stars, the comfortable repetition of a life that had found its rhythm and settled into it without apology. And somewhere, in facilities she'd never visit again and conference rooms where her name would never be spoken aloud, people filed reports about incidents that never officially happened. Systems got updated. Protocols got refined. Clearances got flagged with special handling instructions. The machinery of classification and secrecy turned the way it always did, preserving some truths, protecting some people, ensuring that work done in the shadows stayed in the shadows even when it occasionally intersected with the ordinary world in ways that couldn't be completely hidden. Avery wasn't part of that machinery anymore. Hadn't been for years, but she'd been part of it long enough that it would always recognize her, always respond to her credentials, always grant her the access and authority she'd earned even when she had no intention of using them. That was enough, more than enough. She went to bed again, slept again, woke up to another morning that looked just like the one before it and the one before that. And she was okay with that. More than okay, actually. Grateful, satisfied, at peace with the choices she'd made and the life she'd built and the person she'd become after being so many other things for so many years. Because here's the final truth about dignity, about respect, about the kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself but simply exists. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't require acknowledgement. It doesn't depend on other people understanding or appreciating or even noticing. Dignity is what you carry with you when everything else has been stripped away. When the missions end and the clearances are activated one last time and then never again. When the uniform gets put away and the stories become things you can't tell and the people you served with scatter to their own quiet lives. Dignity is knowing you did what you were asked to do and more than you were asked to do, and things that nobody asked for but that needed doing anyway. It's knowing that you served with honor even when that service couldn't be honored, that you made sacrifices that couldn't be acknowledged, that you carried weight that couldn't be shared. And it's knowing that when some young guard mocked your ID card because it looked old and obsolete and irrelevant, you had the strength to let them learn instead of letting them burn. That you chose to be better than the situation required, kinder than the insult deserved, more generous than anyone had a right to expect. Because dignity isn't about getting what you deserve. It's about being who you are regardless of whether anyone else recognizes it. Avery Cross understood that, had lived it, had proven it without needing to prove anything at all. And on her street, in her house, in the life she'd chosen after all the lives that had been chosen for her, she carried that understanding the way she carried everything else. Quietly, steadily, without complaint or explanation. Just the simple, profound reality of someone who knew exactly who she was and didn't need anyone else's permission to be it. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in the acting, it reminds everyone watching that respect is not something you earn through rank or status or clearance levels. It's something you give freely to every person you encounter, until they prove they don't deserve it. And even then, even when they've shown themselves to be less than they could be, you can still choose to respond with grace instead of vengeance, with teaching instead of destruction, with the quiet confidence of someone who has nothing to prove, because they've already proven everything that matters. That's dignity. That's strength. That's the kind of service that continues long after the official service ends. And Avery Cross carried it the way she'd carried everything else in her life. With honor, with purpose, with the understanding that some things matter more than recognition. Some things matter simply because they're right. And being right in the end is its own reward.